YouTube, let me take you on a journey of exquisiteness that is the local Philly cheesesteak scene.
Radio Free Innsmouth, episode 328, picking up from a couple weeks ago with a second episode about Branikald. Quick refresher, there was a black metal scene, collective type thing, operating out of Russia back in the 90s, named Blazebirth Hall, primarily centered around the autistic outputs of three fellas named Daggerath, Ulf Gegner Ermanson, and Kaldrad Branislav, all three of whom were in fact wild and crazy guys. But out of all three of those guys, my favorite material always came from Kaldrad, specifically his solo project, Branikald. This week we'll be covering what I would like to call the classic period of Branikald's discography.
그리고 진짜 제가 해보고 싶은 게
Why yes, as a matter of fact, I did think about the Roman Empire today, and it provides a pretty good model for Branikald's discography, because in episode 326, we covered the Stormheit, Tukampf, Vargfjörn, Tornet, and Ridjandalir albums. You can kind of think of Stormheit and Tukampf as being like Rome when it was a monarchy, and then Vargfjörn, Tornet, and specifically Ridjandalir as the Roman Republic, you know, sort of establishing the idea of what we think of as Rome. Spoiler alert, but when the final Branikald episode comes out, it's going to be about the albums Ulveger, Razduvaya, Ting Vektrov, Tinglov, Nashlas, Dias Raspre, and Triumph Voli. The final four Branikald albums, that's kind of like the Byzantines, you know, the real late Roman Empire where it kind of turned into something else. But this week, the five albums we're covering, released between 1997 and 1999, this is like the Roman Empire of Branikald. When you think of Branikald, when anybody out there says Branikald, starts talking about Branikald when they're drunk at the black metal bar, they're probably talking about this stuff. I kind of like all three eras of Branikald, which is why it's separated into 3 episodes. But this is by far my favorite, and definitely the most artistically significant output from this band. So much so that it kind of transcends its typical Natsock black metal environs to the point where this is just like important dark music on an international level, to the point where one of the best Blazebirth Hall influenced projects, that being Sanguine Eagle from New York, was helmed by a fella named Simon Santana. And when you see him, you're like,
oh my lucky stars, a Negro.
What I'm trying to make here is, it doesn't really matter where you're from, what your ideological background is. If you claim to be into black metal and you don't like Branikald, I just find that pretty suspicious. Now I can understand if you're into black metal and you're unfamiliar with Branikald, it can be kind of a daunting task to break down this band's discography, since they have 13 albums and they're all amazing. Like even the 5 album run we're covering this week, it's a task to listen to all of it. I mean, it's 5 albums of super raw black metal in a foreign language with really abstract cover art. But that's why I'm here. I'm going to help break down Branikald's discography for you. And in fact, you can split the classical era of Branikald down a little bit farther to make things even easier. Because out of those 5 albums, I would say 3 of them sort of fall into one stylistic tradition, that being Kveldulv, A Life Betrayal to the Life Denial, and Rumsmjod of Misanthropy. They're all a little bit more riff-based and aggressive, and then the second category would be the more ambient-oriented, abstract kind of work on Blick and Wintercalled. We'll start with the more aggressive, riffy albums first, since they're a little bit easier to parse for those less experienced in black metal. The first album to be released from this group was Kveldulv in October of 1997, and it does share some stylistic commonalities with the Roman Republic era of Branikald, particularly with Vargfjörn Tornet. It just happens to be a lot more aggressive. And you can hear that in the very first riff at the start of the album, which features an ascending sort of chromatic series of notes with that dun 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 that in its tail end opens up into a more droning sort of tremolo-picked melodic phrase, from which the rest of the song opens up into more expansive melodiousness, with a lot of different consonant flowing melodic layers sort of twisting into each other around that uncharacteristically chromatic focused riff skeleton. As the song progresses, the chromatic portion of the riff switches from ascending to descending. So instead of each melodic phrase starting out with dun dun dun, it goes dun dun dun. Yeah, like that. Here it's going to come around again in a couple seconds. There we go.
The one that goes beep boo boo bop boo boo beep.
No, man, you're thinking of beep, boo, boo, bop, boo, boo, bop.
It's a pretty interesting way to structure a song, and it shows how Branikald is able to take simpler elements and expand upon them in a macrocosmic sense. In 1998, Branikald followed up on the style of Kveldulv with the album A Life Betrayal to a Life Denial, which displays Kaldrad's melodic sense at its most alienated and harsh. A lot of the melodies on this album have a stately, almost folkish quality to them, like something the barge haulers from the Ilya Repin painting might be humming. But those melodies are reinterpreted through the lens of Transylvanian Hunger and Panzerfaust era Dark Throne, all over a very mechanistic sort of drum beat being provided by new drummer Ron Zverdi, who has replaced the old Blazebirth Hall standby wizard. This hypnotic effect is enhanced by one of the more abrasive Branikald production jobs. Somehow it's simultaneously muddy and incredibly dry sounding. But as the songs progress, the melodies do start to open up with a bit of a shimmering quality like you're hearing right now. And there's a sort of furtiveness to the melodic layers, kind of like a sneakiness that I find interesting. Like you get that shimmering guitar out front, but then there's that droning bassier sort of thing going on in the background. That'll be a common feature of Branikald's songwriting going forward, but it's especially notable on this album. The third album from this sort of sound era of Branikald is Rumsmjod of Misanthropy, which honestly might be one of the better entry points for the Blazebirth Hall novice, given that these are by far the shortest and most concise songs Branikald ever put out. It's also got this crazy goblin shark looking thing on the cover, which definitely captures the sense of savagery that they're going for, given that this is also the most aggressive and hateful Branikald album. Official English title is The Mead of Misanthropy.
What kind of mead are we gonna make? Well, I'm glad you asked, fellow YouTubers, because we're making a Skittles mead.
Mead, of course, being utilized in the Norse pagan sense here as a tincture bringing sort of ecstatic violence, which is definitely fitting in the kind of stuff we got going on this album. Riff phrases tend to be shorter than what we've come to expect from Branikald, but the song structures still have at least one big turnaround in each of them where they kind of open up into wider vistas. The guitars get a little bit more shimmery and rather akin to something Bothana would do, because spoiler alert, the Bothana guy's a big Branikald fan. And overall, it's a pretty sick album, and it does a really good job of capping off the more aggressive strain of this particular kind of middle era of Branikald. Coming up next, we've got...
이번에 처음으로
Oh, you want to talk about the most famous song on this album, Horrid Storms, which, yeah, it's a good song. I mean, you put it on. It's got that... kind of riffage that's always a real crowd pleaser. And for a lot of people, this was one of the first Branikald songs they ever heard because it was on the Hammerkrieg compilation. But
Okay, here's the thing, YouTube.
it's not really a Branikald song if you really look at it, because it's the only song with the Branikald band name attached to it that wasn't written by Kaldrad. It's actually written by Daggerath from the band Rundagor. And stylistically, it bears a lot more in common with Ravendark and Daggerath's own band Rundagor, or at the very least, Forest, than it does with the standard Branikald kind of track. I mean, you could tell the production's even different on that song. It's really more of a bonus track. So good song, not really that important in the overall Branikald scheme of things, if you ask me. So now we move into the other major component of this era of Branikald, that being the more ambient, abstract, out there, spacey kind of albums, represented by Winterkald and Blick. They both got Kald in the title, they both got blue on the cover.
Freeze, 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 freeze. Cool party.
And together, they represent possibly the best of Branikald, certainly my personal favorite version of this band. Of the two albums, Winterkald seems to get talked about a little bit more by the black metal community at large, perhaps because it's a little bit easier to digest than Blickavkald is, and it's definitely a good album. One of the ambient tracks on this, the opener, Night and Fog, is a real standout as far as Branikald's forays into making purely ambient music go. Most of the song's runtime consists of this decidedly sinister sounding musical phrase, which loops on recursively until the song opens up into newer melodic vistas towards the end of its runtime. Easily one of the darkest sounding Branikald tracks, and appropriate given that it's named after a 1941 directive issued by Adolf Hitler, calling for the disappearance of certain political activists that had become onerous to the regime. The song also has a really nice sort of unraveling section at the end, where its elements kind of collapse in on themselves and everything slows down and turns into drones. These sorts of sections have always been a major strength and identifiable characteristic of Branikald's music. The black metal tracks on this album are also no slouch. This album features the most cold and icy guitar tone that Branikald ever went with, which is appropriate given that the album title in English is literally Winter Cold.
Allow me to break the ice.
But at the same time, it's not as harsh or sharp as it is on the more aggressive albums we opened the episode with. It's definitely a very meditative sort of experience. The songs all move and build on themselves very slowly and subtly, with gradually morphic layers of frozen melody, like the one that's playing right now that I often catch myself humming. It's sort of a weird riff that doesn't really seem to have a distinct beginning or end, which is a noticeable characteristic of this ambient era of Branikald. And the melodic section that comes after it kind of blends elements of that melodic riff with the more ambient sort of opening riff, kind of twisting them together into one sort of mass. Like I said, much more extract era of Branikald, and that goes doubly for Blick, which is easily my personal favorite Branikald album. That said, it's not an easy album to get into. In fact, it's structured in such a way that it almost seems initially purposefully inaccessible. But if you really pay attention to how Blick flows as an album, you can start to parse its genius. For starters, the first track on the album, Upon the Waves of Inspiration, is also the longest song on the album at 14 minutes, and it's entirely ambient. No standard distorted guitar black metal type stuff at all. But more than that, as you're hearing right now, the melodic phrases really don't have any sort of recognizable beginning or end. It kind of just keeps going, but it does so in a way that still feels structured if you really pay attention to how the songs are moving around. It's about as far from your standard riff-based metal as you can get, but at the same time, it doesn't really have that much in common with drone music or more stereotypical dark ambient music at all either. Branikald's ambient songs really are kind of their own thing that don't really sound like anybody else unless they're purposefully trying to sound like Branikald. They also tend to be shockingly beautiful, especially for a band considered raw black metal. This is probably one of the most savagely beautiful emanations from the Branikald or even larger Blazebirth Hall cult. So yeah, 14-minute long ambient song at the beginning of the album. Might seem a little weirdly structured, but it actually plays very well in this album's overall compositional schema, because the next track, Steel of Strained Strings Inspiration, very much continues the compositional philosophy behind that opening ambient track, just in a more normal distorted guitar-based black metal context. It's still made up almost entirely of melodies that are very hard to parse where they start and end, and they all kind of bleed into each other, but not in a way that seems disorganized, rather in a way that seems very organic, like moss and lichen growing on a rock over hundreds of years, or maybe ivy growing up a castle wall if you want to get a little bit more corny dungeons with your black metal similes. This song also has the best example of what I like to call the Branikald unraveling section in the entire discography. The drums drop out entirely, and you just get these droning sort of tremolo riffs before even the more tremolo pick-based approach is abandoned, and you just have individual notes being picked out. The time signature also switches from that dogmatic 4/4 black metal beat to a very waltzy 3/4 kind of thing as these melodies spin off. But as they're spinning off, they also become decidedly more concrete than they were at the beginning of the song. And that trend continues into the next track, Wild Sleckning of Sails. This one comes in real hard and heavy right from the beginning, but more important than for the conceptual scheme of the album, it's also very riff-based. There's very distinctive musical phrases, and it's much easier to follow. It's kind of like the band is gradually tightening their focus as the album reaches its center point. I mean, you've still got more expansive, shimmery, tremolo pick sections like this one right here, but even then, it's still a lot more riff-based and not as abstract and spacey as the first two songs in the album were. And it even has something of a breakdown section coming up, or at least as close as Branikald ever gets to a breakdown. Right after we get through all of these shimmering, more high-pitched, note-based musical phrases. And here comes that breakdown bit I was talking about. Dun-dun-dun. That's the breakdown bit. You know, not your standard picking up change doing windmills in the pit kind of breakdown, but still a much more normal sort of black metal riff transition than the really weird, almost liquid-like transitions between musical phrases that was going on during Steel of Strings Inspiration. From there, the song progresses in typical Branikald fashion into an unraveling bit before hitting another entirely ambient, clean guitar sort of track that is pretty much the opposite of the kind of track that opened the album up, because all you're gonna hear is that musical phrase looped for about 9 minutes. It doesn't have the weird wandering quality of On the Waves of Inspiration at all. Instead, it's like you've been immersed in the point of the music itself. It's the most narrow this album's focus has gotten, as they sort of been like zooming in more and more. And it's kind of the centerpiece of the album in that respect. Certainly the peak of its story arc in terms of where they're heading with their songwriting. After that, you get Kveldulv, part 1 of 2 of what I like to call the Kald duology. This song's actually the reason why, even though it says Blick Kveldulv on the cover of the tape, and most people call this album Blick Kveldulv, I always like to call it by its Russian name, Kveldulv, because he yells it right at the beginning of this track, and it sounds fucking awesome. This is probably his most impassioned vocal moment of this stage of Branikald's musical career, and that's really saying something, because he's always been one of my favorite black metal vocalists. This song's another one that's very riff-based and easy to follow, much like Wild Selecting of Sails, even if they do still incorporate a whole lot of that weird kind of wandering ambience of some of the guitar playing vicissitudes, particularly during this rather expansive section that occurs right before the introduction, or rather reintroduction, of the song's main melodic motif, which is going to hit right here. So you remember that part from the beginning of the song, right? Good stuff. And it also leads directly into the last song, which is sort of a summation of the journey that listening to this album is. Because it's based entirely around that same melodic motif, but it's one of the clean guitar ambient songs doing it now. And they bring back that sort of 3/4 unraveling feel from the end of the second song, Steel of Strings Inspiration. But in this case, it feels less unraveling and more like unfurling and cascading downward into darkness. Just a shimmering blue wall of sound. I know there's a decent amount of skepticism regarding Blaze Berthal amongst a lot of black metallurgists, but I gotta think, if there's one album that can convince you that there really is some major artistic merit going on with the Blaze Berthal stuff, gotta be Blick Kveldulv. Easily one of the best black metal albums ever made, in my estimation. And I'm hoping I managed to convince you of that over the course of this episode. Because like I said, this is kind of the peak era of Branikald. All the albums we've talked about here, they're all pretty amazing. But even if I didn't, thanks for listening or watching, or whatever you did, and I'll catch you next time.
I sent him a medium pizza with anchovies, pineapples, and jalapenos. Then I had them put extra buffalo sauce and light cheese, and then make it well done on the bake.